Sup, and welcome to Idle Chit Chat with Velodus. This is an essay series thing in which I will be discussing things, random subjects that are on my mind, that are interesting to me in the moment that I'm recording these. And I will talk about said things while roaming around the map in a video game so that you're not staring at nothing while you're watching these. And sometimes the thing I'll be discussing will be the video game itself, but usually not. A normal YouTuber making a video like this would just be showing themselves talking right now, like they'd be showing you their face, and that would account for the visual aspect of the video, but I don't like doing that. That is not how I roll. And also, I tend to think that video game environments are more interesting than my face anyway, so that's what I'm providing for you. In this series, at least in the beginning, the game that I will be playing / not playing is Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. And I chose this game to be the one in the background, at least at the start, because Spider-Man games are some of the only video games that are set in a modern, contemporary setting like this, in which it's actually fun to travel around. Normally, in a setting like this, you'd just be driving the whole time to get to places, and I find that boring, because I drive every day in real life, and so driving in a video game isn't that exciting to me. It's kind of why I've never been that big a fan of racing games to begin with, unless it's something out there like Mario Kart or Burnout. But when you get to places via web swinging, like in this game, it's fun. There's something naturally compelling about it, but not too compelling. I don't want what you're looking at to be distracting, and I feel like Spider-Man web swinging strikes the perfect balance of being not boring, but not so interesting that it makes it hard to concentrate on what I'm saying. Also, if you're familiar with this channel, you'll know that I did a series just like this called Slingin' Things, but in that series, I was reviewing things while playing Spider-Man, whereas in this series, I'm musing on things. Big difference, sort of. Anyway, the irony of me preferring if you knew as little about my personal life as possible is that I otherwise plan to be very open in this series, much more than I was in Slingin' Things. I intend to be honest and transparent about subjects that might occasionally dip into being somewhat heavy. That won't exclusively be what the series is about, obviously. In fact, the reason I'm calling this Idle Chit Chat is so that I can give myself the room to talk about things that are frivolous too, but I like having the option to be serious when I want to. And also, Idle Chit Chat is a self-deprecating name, which fits my style. I like having an outlet like this where I can be my pure, unvarnished, dorky self, no matter how mundane or difficult the topic might be. And that's why this series exists. It is a catch-all for whatever the hell I want to talk about that isn't specifically a review of something. And to coincide with the launch of this series, I have changed my username, and thus the name of this channel, to Velodus! Velodus. Before this, my username was reetae27, and I put stuff up on this channel under that name for almost 7 years. Ugh, Jesus. And you might be wondering, why did I make this change? Why did I go from one nonsense username to another nonsense username? Like, what's the point? Well, mostly, I just got tired of my old username. You know, I had been reetae27 for a while, and I just realized one day that I didn't think it represented me that well anymore. I was ready to not have people identify me as that online anymore. And there are some specific reasons for this that I might get into one day in a later episode, but suffice to say, I just felt like going in a different direction. Plus, the whole point of this channel is that I like to take risks. I like to take on very ambitious projects and make weird videos that are kind of unconventional and do different things. And so even though it's intimidating to quote-unquote rebrand after all this time, I felt it was necessary for myself. And when I came up with a new name that I liked, and I'll tell you how I did that in a minute, I leapt on it. Like, I like Velodus so much more than my old name. And I'm fully aware of the fact that it's going to be kind of awkward because all the videos that I put up before this have my old username on them, and I can't change that. So if you look closely, you're still going to see these remnants of reetae 27 on my channel. It's going to be like how I watched a Vox video on Hong Kong recently, and in it they were talking about how Hong Kong used to be a British colony, and because the British controlled it for so long, their influence on Hong Kong could still be felt even after all these years. Like, there were still these aspects of Hong Kong that were only there because they were leftovers of the British regime. My channel is going to be kind of like that. It's Velodis from here on out, but if you look at anything I did before 2021, you're going to see these artifacts of when I was going by something else, which might be momentarily confusing, but hey, if I can make that adjustment after all that time, I'm sure you can too. Now, throughout these videos, I may occasionally ask a question as a way to engage you, the precious viewer. A totally optional question that you don't have to answer if you don't want to. You can totally ignore this. But if you do feel like sharing your viewpoint in the comments, it would be appreciated. And in this case, I genuinely would like to hear from as many people as possible because I find it interesting. How did you come up with your username? How did you decide that your current moniker is what you want to be known as online? And if you're not using a moniker, and if you're instead going by your real name, why are you doing that? Why have you elected to not be known as Fishmonger55 or some other weird name that other people are rolling with? I'm curious because I'm old enough to have lived through the early days of the internet, when usernames weren't taken that seriously. Like, in the late 1990s/early 2000s, people didn't think that they would actually be identifying themselves as their username in real life. They looked at usernames as a disposable placeholder kind of thing, a thing that no one was ever going to see in real life. And so when a lot of people came up with their usernames, they did so either flippantly or they did it as a joke. You know, there'd be people on AIM or on forums who'd be like, I'm ZeldaFan42, because they didn't think it deserved more thought than that. But then there'd be people who were like, I'm Big Dick 53, because to them, the whole point of being on the internet was so that they could be whatever they wanted to be. And so they figured, well, shit, if I'm gonna choose something, I'm gonna choose something ridiculous. You know, I'll be Pen 15. Why not? And what's funny is that as the years went on, and as the internet morphed into this thing that was at the center of everyone's life, people's online handles started to actually represent them. And there were a bunch of people who found themselves desperately wanting to get out of the username that they had chosen for themselves when they were younger. Like, there were a lot of people who had created their PlayStation IDs when they were a kid, and the name they had come up with was something cringy, like Jar Jar Binks 420, and it wasn't until they got older that they realized that they couldn't change it, and they were like, please, Sony, make it so that I can change my name. I don't want to be Jar Jar Binks 420 anymore. I've grown past that, please. And Sony eventually capitulated, like a lot of media companies did. But there are still major sites and apps out there where you get one chance to pick your ID. And if you make it something terrible, too bad, you are stuck with it forever. I myself had a few different terrible usernames before I settled on this primary one. I think it's almost impossible to make a non-embarrassing username when you're young and when your taste is questionable. When I was like 15, there was this gaming forum that I was really active on, and my name on it was Death God, because I was a huge anime fan and I was really into Death Note, and in my head, I had chosen a username that was more powerful than everyone else's. Ugh, so bad. Then I got into AIM very late. AIM stood for AOL Instant Messenger, by the way, in case you didn't know. It's how people used to chat online before Facebook came around and killed it. And my AIM name was Xbox 360 Wraith, because the Xbox 360 had just been announced, and I liked using the Wraith in StarCraft, and so I combined those things like a dork, and I remember thinking how cool it was that I was calling myself by the 360 when it hadn't even been released yet. Like, that's how trendy I was. Ugh. Then, when I started writing for a website, I became Zombie Monte because I was a huge Golden State Warriors fan, and Monte Ellis was their best player, and I liked zombies. My usernames were not particularly deep back then, and at some point, I decided that I needed a more centralized username that wasn't just based on whatever the hell I was into at the time. And so I sat down and thought about it. And I decided that I should use a character name that I had come up with from one of the stories that I was writing. Because from a young age, I had wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to write a fantasy book one day, like J.R.R. Tolkien. I was a huge Lord of the Rings fan growing up. And one of the stories that I had started writing, because I never finished any of them, was about a retired bounty hunter named Reetae. And I really liked the name Reetae because I had totally invented it. It was a name that no one in real life had as their first name, as far as I could tell when I Google searched Reetae. And I decided to co-opt that name and make it my own. And so my username for a bit was just Reetae. But then it turned out that there were people who had actually squatted on that username, and so I couldn't use it universally, which annoyed me, and I didn't want to have to add numbers at the end of it, because that kind of makes it feel amateurish, in my view, but I didn't know what else to do, so I took my favorite number, which is 27, and I added it to the end of my username, and so I became Reetae27. This is probably way more of a deep dive than you're remotely interested in, but oh well. Anyway, I got tired of that username, and by extension, the previous name of this channel. And so I began the hunt for a new username, one that was short, easy to spell, and more original. Original enough that it wouldn't need a number at the end of it. And what I did is, because I'm usually terrible at coming up with usernames, I wrote down a list of all my previous user IDs, including some I had totally forgotten about. And then I wrote down all the character names from stories that I had written, some of which I had written when I was like a kid. And then I tried smashing those two things together and forming portmanteaus with them in the hope of stumbling upon some combination that sounded not horrible. And it took a while, but eventually actually worked. I looked at the name Volo that I had written down, who was a speedy character from the same story that Reetae was from, and then I looked at the word Lotus, like the flower, which I went by when I played games in computer class instead of paying attention to the teacher, and when I collided those two words together, it made Volo Lotus, and when I took out one of the lows, I had Velodus. And I immediately liked it and knew that that was what I wanted my username to be from now on. It's short, it's original, I think, and it just kind of sounds like the name of a YouTuber. The only complication was finding a precise enough spelling of it that was available, so I had to tweak the letters a little bit, but for whatever reason, this spelling of Velodus was unclaimed pretty much everywhere, and I jumped on it, and the rest, as they say, is history. History that, again, might not mean anything to anyone else, but hey, if you're new to this channel, you should know that I am nothing if not someone who is capable of devoting an entire video to what their username is. And thus begins this illustrious series. In the next episode, I'll be discussing an eternal debate in the world of Japanese animation. And after that, I'll be discussing one of the most controversial video game reviews in history. And after that, I'll be discussing one of the most famous Americans to ever die in a volcanic eruption. And in the episode after that, I have no idea because I haven't thought quite that far ahead yet, but I'm sure it'll be okay.